folks. This is Matt. We're back with another episode of Downright Mindful. We're excited that you're here to listen with us and to join in on the conversation. I'm here with my co-host, Paul.
That was a dramatic pause. I think you wanted me to say something. Hey, Matt.
As always. And I tell you, I'm about to make a point, Paul. If you'll think back, especially our faithful listeners, our first episode, I made the claim that it would only take me a couple phone calls and I could get the mayor on the phone.
That's a fact.
Now that's not a fact. It's
yes,
still not proven. I haven't needed to pull that metaphorical trigger yet. But I did one better. I called and I got a state senator on the phone.
Ooh.
It was more of a cryptically worded text.
It's
the same result.
So this is a dear friend, one of those Lee University transplant Cleveland homeboys who now resides across the river in the McMinn County, Senator Dr. J. Adam Lowe. Welcome. Man, that's downright mindful.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Did we just become best friends? Yep.
We don't make mistakes. We have happy accidents.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I don't need backups. I'm going to Harvard.
Remember these words. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
Do or do not. There is no try.
I still have a dream.
Welcome to Downright Mindful, a meeting place where we explore meaning, seek connections, and examine the relationships between people, events, and the ideas that shape our world. Hosted by me, Matt Paris, my friend and colleague Paul Sawswell, each episode will dive into thoughtful conversations that spark reflection and curiosity. Thanks for joining us. Now let's get right down to it. Senator Dr. J. Adam Lowe, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Are you going to backtrack audience applause in that moment for this podcast?
We could.
Yes.
Because I've always wanted, you don't get applause when the senator thing comes out.
No.
You get applause with other labels, but not with that one.
Yeah, I got you. Hey, we had Zach Pike on last week, and you were just sharing a memory with me. You want to describe that a little more now that I've pressed record?
So yeah, I forgot where the gas station was, somewhere East Cleveland.
First of all, are you sure this was Zach Pike or was it Chad Oinby?
Probably Chad Oinby. I thought it was Zach.
It could have been both of them.
It might have been. It might have been all three of you guys, for all I know. I don't know. I just know I stumbled upon to this raggedy minivan.
That's Chad Oinby.
With you guys in it, clearly in street clothes. And I'm like, oh, hey, how you doing? And it was like the death stare of you got to go. And I realized these guys are on a drug bust. They're fixing to buy some stuff on behalf of our wonderful sheriff's department and put some bad guys away. And I'm standing in the way. And so I cleared out pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But I will say no one was more convincing in a drug buy than Chad Oinby. He was very convincing that day.
Yeah, you'd sell that guy some drugs.
Well, I was very suspect of what was happening in the van at the moment. It was either you were on a drug bust or I really needed to have a conversation with the sheriff about who was employing at the sheriff's department. But
no, I will tell you, that's a scene that's out of a movie, man. I've seen that happen in movies where, undercover officers are maybe on a stakeout or whatever, and they see a friend and they're like, hey, how's it going? And there's no real good way to be like, hey, we're doing something.
Bad timing.
But yeah, that's hilarious. I had forgotten all about that. I'm glad you brought it up. Now, help me with this. You guys, you and Paul, there's a couple years difference between you guys, right?
Yeah, I would say Paul's the old man in the room.
He's the old man in
Class
the room.
of 95.
Clearly old man
Just
in the room.
wanted to establish that. I want to.
Well, let's establish that. I just said class of 95.
He needs the elderly label.
I'm a word.
Speaking of, how's that room at Life Care?
1977. Throw a date out there, please.
1977. So you're clearly Gen X. I'm a millennial by 2 days.
Get it.
Is that a zennial?
No, I'm a millennial by 2 days.
Yeah.
Like I'm 2 days away from being Gen X.
Yeah, I've heard this idea recently. They're calling zennials.
So the generational thing's interesting because they divide it up in real time when it's happening. And then historically they go back and redefine it.
Of course.
Based on markers that are hindsight's 2020, right?
Yeah, sure.
That you can clearly see. So, now we're into Gen Alpha, and it's the Gen Xers are so far. They're like the boomers for most people nowadays.
That is the silliest thing I've heard all day.
It's true.
No.
It's very silly.
You just said 2 days you were a millennial. And I'm at 77, which is the back end of that. And all this meshes together when they start to come, like 1980. Reagan is still my childhood president. Who's your childhood president?
It would be Reagan.
Yeah. See what I'm saying?
But they draw this line.
Were you playing Atari?
I played it.
You had one red button. See?
Yeah, one red button.
See? Did you watch E.T.?
I identify more with Gen X than I do the millennials.
Of course you do.
Because I was really on the front end. In fact, they call our generation post Gen X. Now remember talk about the redefining, going back and kind of historically redefining.
Yeah.
The early millennials and the Gen Xers are really saying we're one, and they call us. That's when they kind of get into the zennial piece.
Yeah.
We were early enough to experience technology, but we didn't necessarily have, computers, but we were early adopters. So we ushered in the video game culture. We were old enough to interact with devices. They built the Game Boy around how we saw mobile gaming. So there really is some truth to the fact that you
said all that to say, I'm 3 years older than you.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, we've now established the answer to the question.
I know.
I heard a guy on social media the other day put zennials this way. He said, the only reason you played Atari was because you were too poor for a Nintendo. And the only reason you watched Thundercats is because your older brother he could choose the channels. And I was like, man, this guy watched my childhood.
But you hit a kind of nail on the head. A lot of it's identified by technological advances.
Sure it is.
You can take it in the more sociological angle, right? I grew up a Steelers fan. Now, the Steelers didn't win a Super Bowl in my lifetime, but the hype from my older cousins, people in my space who were, a little older than I am that I looked up to, they carried that banner, right? So it was Pittsburgh Steelers, the Iron Curtain, all that, Steel Curtain, all that kind of thing. And so I became this Steelers fan because we didn't really have a team in the South. The Falcons were horrible, and so it was long before the Carolina Panthers came around. So you look at a lot of different elements and we look back and we can kind of define them. And those are interesting as we kind of talk about blocks. But all of that's based on trying to lump people into some sense of sameness that I kind of fundamentally reject anyway.
Yeah.
So, I identify with Paul, even though they've drawn this hard deck line between Gen X and millennial somewhere in a book.
But even like Gen Z, like in the literature, it's also been identified as iGen, like the I generation, that little bitty I, right? Because of all the technology that's been created in our little ones, which aren't so little anymore, but they haven't known anything different. Our little ones, like my nieces, certainly iPad in hand, when we were giving our kids actual toys to play with, these were given actual iPads to play with, there's this different dynamic that's been created. But because we do this in my history class, we have the 9 generations after the Civil War. And we try to make sure that we don't draw the hard lines, but we do identify, Reagan being elected. That's a line drawn, and the American narrative goes a particular direction once he takes over.
Right.
Right. And then you back up. Even Gen X, I was a latchkey kid. Were you a latchkey kid?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, that whole X was like, that is that variable that we haven't quite figured out what the answer is to yet. That's how my generation was identified, me and my older sisters.
Well, in nice little 2020s culture, we love to identify any group of people by the worst thing about them.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Like we when millennials were growing up and entering the workforce, we teased how bad they had a work ethic. We talked about how ignorant Gen X was because it was post-draft culture. We talked about, the boomers. I mean, there's a sense that we want to be critical of anything that we don't identify with. Yeah. And it probably need to escape that. Truthfully, aside from all of those labels, most of us connect with the types of music and entertainment we pursue. And there are old souls in younger generations. I got a kid, my youngest son's 14, and he's an 80s rock fanatic.
Really?
Like everything from Hall & Oates to AC/DC. I mean, that's his musical culture. Like that's what he draws to. Huh. I was a little bit of an old soul growing up. But truthfully, when you get into young adulthood, the biggest thing that's going to define connection between people for you is what stage you're raising your children in. Like Paul and I connected because our kids were the same age and played basketball. And I coached them in elementary school, and Paul kind of helped coach too. And our kids were the same age. One of my best friends, Derek Kinsey, is 10 years older than I am. Uh-huh. Why did we connect? We were business partners. We're still close friends. Well, because our sons were the same age growing up. So it led us to spend a lot of time together. And so we often forget about, if you're an early family planning kind of person like I was, where I had my children young, a lot of my peer groups are slightly older than I am. If you were late in life, having children, you're going to connect with those younger generations. So there are just elements of how we live that transcend all of that big generational stuff. And we'll leave it for Paul to discuss in the history class with his students. But when you're getting kind of down and you're talking to our kids, right? Like you're talking to your kids, how do you need to see the world? How do you need to identify yourself and all that kind of stuff? Like I said, I kind of dismiss those hard deck labels a little bit, because I think in the moment you're going to find that you identify with people based on where you are in life at any moment.
Yeah. I was thinking about something just earlier today, and something you just said sort of brought this to my memory. As you and I, the way we met it's Pee Wee football, right?
Right.
Like that's what
the only real way to meet anybody.
That's the only real. Yeah. Some of my best friends came from the bleachers, at those football games. Anyways, you were one of the first people I heard say the term. Let's see, what was it? Rugged masculinity.
Oh, yeah.
This is just as we're entering the COVID world.
Yeah.
Is that what it was?
Well, there was an assault on it. Yeah. It was rugged individualism.
Okay.
But I think you could quickly pivot to rugged masculinity on some of that.
Well, I was thinking, sometimes I just had some downtime earlier, and I had just sat down. I didn't have anything on my list. I just finished reading a little bit, was about to move into setting up and doing some other things. And I just sat down for like 5 minutes, and there were some pictures flashing of my family. And a lot of those were Kyler's childhood memories and this and that. And the thought hit me, like, it's 2025. And it's been a challenge to sort of help mentor and mold and shape this boy into something that looks and feels like the old men in my life when I was a kid, the rugged, just the greatest generation kind of guys, but also be able to navigate a world that we walk through today. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know if I've done that or not. And if it has been done, it had a lot of things to do with forces outside my control. Are those weird thoughts to be having in 2025?
No, man. Listen, number one, you have a great kid, right? He's a man now.
Well, thank you for that.
I think you've raised quite an awesome young man. Paul, you have too. I mean, you both of you guys had sons slightly older than my son, who I didn't mind my son looking up to. That's always a positive,
sure,
kind of feedback on some things. When we talk about rugged individualism, it was demonized in COVID culture because we were trying to, society was trying to compel everybody to not be selfish, mm-hmm, and to think of the greater community good. And to do those things, you need to get vaccinated. I mean, go down the list. And we don't have to get in the political weeds on whether those things were validated for public safety or whatnot. But that was the narrative, right? Mm-hmm. That was the thing that was being communicated to everybody, is You sacrifice self for the public good. And so this notion of rugged individualism, the idea that your individualism is so unpolished that it cannot consider others, was how it was being billed. Yet, when you look at anyone who's been the great innovators and pioneers, explorers, technicians, the brilliance of society, there's some sense of rugged individualism there. And at the time that was going on, I had the radio show. We talked about it in depth. And I think we even kind of created this. We did a whole show on, all right, you want to talk about rugged individualists? And we were talking about, Martin Luther King. And I mean, going just down this list of all these great people, that the traits that were being demonized at the moment were what led us to change. Yeah. Because it takes resistance to the social momentum to change the course of humanity or any culture or society, right? So you can't do that without rugged individualists. So when you talk about like the old fellas of old, we kind of look at it for two sides of a coin. There's what an individual can do for society. And during COVID, we were told that the best thing an individual can do for society is to comply and blend in. Yeah. Rugged individualism says the best thing someone can do for society is challenge it, innovate it, press it, alter it, reform it, right? So then there's this side that you're talking about of the coin, which is this audacity of independence, that not only am I going to reform society, or I'm going to be a transformative personality in that space, I'm also going to be less dependent upon it. I'm not going to define myself by it. I'm going to be able to live without it. I'm going to be able to reject device culture. I'm going to be able to do these things. I'm going to be able to live off the grid, when we get kind of to an extreme image. So it's not only that you're just reforming society, is that you're refusing to take anything away from it as well. And so it's interesting that you bring up that term, because I think it still applies right now, because we're still in this momentum, whether it's public education, the economy, world foreign relations. What does it mean to be ruggedly individualistic? It's the American way, if we look at it from a historical angle. Yeah. And you have a factor of society right now that just completely rejects that and says it's toxic. It's not healthy for society. And, we can debate and get in the weeds on those things all day. But what I'll tell you is we're all fathers of boys. And I have two girls in my mix. So I got to be girl daddy, to two girls. Yeah. I'm raising all of them to be ruggedly individualistic, to not be dependent upon society, to be to be transformers in their space. We have a family motto that is, when you're in a space, you improve the space that you're in. So if you're on a team, the team's better because you're there. If you're on a job, the job's better because you were there. You're always value added in any space that you're in. Well, you can't be that unless you're willing to be something more than the space that you're in, something greater than the space that you're in.
Either one of you aware that rugged individualistic term is a historical term? I mean, it's in my standards.
Like Teddy Roosevelt kind of stuff.
A little bit later than that. This is Herbert Hoover during the Great Depression. And this is what he's saying, hey, I'm going to limit what the government does during this time, because I believe in this American ideal of rugged individualism. And if you can take care of yourself, you can take care of your family. And he extended it to the community, your local community, then we're going to get through this. He was mistaken, because it's going to take Roosevelt coming into this and going, hey, the government, we're going to provide some things that individuals and families and communities aren't able to provide for themselves right now. Now, we have a lot of those programs that were put into place that are still in existence today. And a whole lot of people are saying, hey, do we still need to have these things in existence today? But I mean, this is 95 years ago. So it was actually a collective idea, even though we're using the word individualistic. But it was really Herbert Hoover wanted to keep the government out of intervening during this. And like you talked about already, like in the moment, you can't see this. Herbert Hoover was this World War I hero. I mean, like he was running our rationing program. He is known as the Pirate of Benevolence. He's sending funds and food to Belgium in the middle of World War I. He is using his riches to take care of people in a moment. And then when he's elected president, I mean, he's a super popular dude. And he's one of the presidents that we look back now and go, he's one of our worst. Which, now, if you pause, hold on. The Great Depression crashed on top of him, just like it crashed on top of everybody. But he believes so deeply in this idea of this American ideal that if you can just pull up your bootstraps, you're going to make it. That's when the Roosevelts, and then Dr. King will borrow these terms as well of going, well, what if you don't have boots? You can't pull up your bootstraps. And so for the next 4 terms, you have this one president who is continuing to be reelected and continues to push this government reform of going, hey, we have to help our people. Now, what was that? TVA, the CCC building Harrison Bay State Park, all of these
Blue
ideas.
Ridge Parkway.
Yeah, I mean, like
Social Security, Medicare.
Yes.
You're looking at, so the New Deal, which is arguably the big reform from FDR, that would have been very contrary.
Well, that New Deal,
felt, right?
just pause just for a second, because you mentioned Teddy Roosevelt. So he had a deal as well. And so when FDR comes along and he says, hey, remember Teddy R's, what was his term? I'm losing it here. Do you know this?
Party term?
No, he had a deal. Square deal. His square deal.
Yeah.
Hey, I got square deal for the people because I want to take care of the consumers. I'm going to go after these corporations, a limited amount of corporations of his choosing, and I want to start conserving some things because John Muir has come into his life. Well, FDR comes along and was like, hey, let me give you a new deal. Mm-hmm. That was square. This is new. Now here we go. Now keep going on your new deal because I know you're about to drop something.
Well, historically, when we look back, you could arguably say that's when we started moving into a deficit culture as a nation. Like the biggest entitlements we have today are New Deal entitlements still. And so, again, hindsight's 2020, we get to look back almost 100 years later and ask ourselves, if Hoover had pivoted his way, what would we have looked like 100 years later now? We don't really know. But what we do know is in moments of crisis, there is at least a faction that compels us to reject rugged individualism, just like it did during COVID, right? And we're having those hindsight discussions about COVID-19 right now. Did the shutdown create more problems economically than it solved? Did our approach to health and care? I mean, we now know that we shouldn't have been intubating everybody, right? Can we admit that? Can everybody embrace the fact that that is not a practice anymore? We realized that was causing more harm than good. We know that certain treatments have been pulled off the market and pulled off rapidly. And the truth is, we'll never know in detail the detriment of what happened during COVID-19 because Congress passed a bunch of laws essentially giving blanket immunity. And the courts are a very valuable place where we learn things. We know big tobacco and what happened with cancer because of the courts, right? We know what happened with opioids because of the courts. We'll never have that with COVID-19. And so it's real easy to kind of...
We're not going to find out on a Netflix documentary.
Somebody will make one, but it won't be like evidence in court.
You'll hear somebody's story about it. Yeah,
That's right. That's right.
But the courts are a valuable part of us testing what was true and what wasn't in hindsight, who did wrong, who did right, who manipulated things. And why do I bring that up? Is there's some parallels between the stress of the Great Depression and the fear pandemic that we had during COVID-19, how we responded to that, and the consistency that you just noted, which was FDR coming in and saying, no, we're not going to be, the big government's here to save everything, right? Mm-hmm. The question is, even though we can look back and say, well, those programs did lift us out. And I'm still one of those that says that what lifted us out of the Great Depression was World War II. I still argue that, we were able to shift our economy dramatically.
I concur. You can't deny that. Yeah.
But if you talk to some other people, they'll say, no, it was the New Deal because they feel good about those things. But here we are approaching $40 trillion in national debt. We still don't have a balanced budget at the federal level. we have lingering consequences 100 years later because we rejected. Well, I'm not going to say because we rejected rugged individualism, but because we embraced big funded government socialized programs that have a cost, have a long-term cost. Mm-hmm. What Hoover would argue and what the premise of rugged individualism would argue is if we had become more self-sufficient during those times, less dependent on government, would we be more stable as a society? We don't know. There's no way for us to know. That is the land of science fiction writers who play with timelines, like The Man in the High Castle and those kind of things. Yeah. Or what is it? Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, that movie where they go back and say if things had been different, they get to speculate on all that. Well, why do I bring it up? I'm raising my kids to be rugged individualist because I want them to be reformist. I want them to not draw on society. I want them to contribute to society. And I don't know how when you abandon that narrative, you get there. I think it's tough to parent with another narrative, but I know people do, but I've never been able to embrace that with my style.
Yeah. Hey, is it too late for me to, as we were talking about this, which is a great conversation, by the way, as we were talking about this, the actual term I was thinking of struck me. And it was toxic masculinity.
Well, I thought you were blending the two there for a moment.
I did. I mixed the two terms.
Mixed the two terms. You were like rugged and masculinity.
Yeah, my point was in raising that, there's been some places where you really have to sand off some rough edges, but that's something that you have to do. And I'm going to say, I don't want to pull you into any political weeds at all. I don't mind for myself.
Well, you know that I signed up to be pulled into political weeds.
Yeah, that's true. But the thought hit me, it's a tough job to raise a human in 2025 that doesn't act like a woman.
That's a powerful statement.
Yeah, I know.
Say that again. No. Say that again.
It's a tough job to raise a human in 2025 that doesn't act like a woman.
If you raise them to the standard that PC culture says that you should. Is that what you're
that's if I follow the whims of society, he shares so many traits with the females of our society. And not that there's anything wrong with it. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is we often have these conversations as we move forward in society. We talked about this with AI. What are some things that we let go of? Well, some things that I wasn't willing to let go of as a dad, and I'm still not, is that you treat females. Hang on, I got to be careful how I say this one. There's a world that would want him to treat a woman just like he treats his male counterparts. And that's not Mr. Paris's world. That's not your dad's world. There's a difference. Not better, not worse. In many cases, the women are more precious and they're more special, and we're still going to have some chivalry, and we're going to try to be gentlemen, and we're going to realize that if society were to change today, you'll go kill the food, you'll lift the heavy things, and you'll do the hard stuff. Now, I don't want to drift off into like aluminum hat world, because I'm not that at all. But as society moves forward and the expectations on humans in all the way from public schools into the workplace, there's these boxes that they want us to fit in, and sometimes they don't fit that great.
Well, we deal with this. I gave a lecture one time in a political space, and I was the lone conservative on the panel of 4. That happens quite often. I can't quite figure why there's only one of us in higher academic settings, but it tends to be that way. And I'm fine to be that guy. And this discussion came up. It wasn't necessarily about toxic masculinity, but it was about gender inequity and a lot of those things. And it even drifted into the whole non-binary conversations about society. And I made this argument. I said, I used to be able to say, we as a society used to be able to say, raise your boys to be men. And that was an endearing phrase. It was an instructive phrase. It was a guiding phrase, right? Like that there was some sense of manhood that was necessary to a healthy society. And so to say that was safe wasn't necessarily a controversial statement. Today, it's a very controversial statement because you have some people to argue, well, no, you don't even know that they're going to be a man. right? You don't even, they might decide that they don't want to be a man, or that the notion of manhood is something that is to be rejected. You have a lot of those opinions in the space, but this is where I'll say, I think we went off track. At some point in history, and I'll defer to our resident historian in the room who studies the generations, he may know more explicitly, but probably sometime post 1950s, late 50s, we pivoted to this idea that if something was different, if two things were different, they were inherently inequitable.
Mm-hmm.
And so put that in the context of a genderized society, you know, because males and females were different, there was an inequity there. And some of that we probably baked into culture from times previous. Mm-hmm. But being masculine and being feminine in and of themselves, one's not necessarily superior to the other with regards to value. I was watching a wonderful lecture the other day where somebody was talking about the importance of fathers playing with children, that rapport is built with men, regardless of the gender of their child, in play, and with women in nurturing. And it's why when kids are scared, they run to daddy, and when kids are hurt or something, or they run to mom. You know?
Yeah.
And that when the levels of oxytocin in the brain in both parties, in a play scenario between a man and his child, the levels of oxytocin are higher. And in a nurturing situation between a woman and their child, the levels of oxytocin are higher. Mm-hmm. In fact, if you have them inhale more oxytocin, it fosters more playful, interactive engagement in men and more nurturing behaviors in women. So this is an interesting scientific fact of the differences between males and females and how they're important to a family structure that breed a nurturing environment for children.
Yeah.
But we said because those differences exist, they're not the same, that they're inherently inequitable. And this is why we see a society that, as we argue about the folks who want to see socialism, communism, whatever you want to call it, all of that's a compression to sameness. It's one of my big criticisms of how we've approached education for 100 years, is we've compressed to the middle, right? Like you guys know, you're both educators. There's a sense that you have to teach to the middle a little bit because that's where we test. We test in the middle. You know, everybody needs to learn kind of the same thing. Now we're getting better, at least in our neck of the woods, of saying kids are different. They have different academic and life aspirations. So we create things like the Pi Center locally, which allow for trade careers. We've started to leave the sameness argument in education, but for so long, man, that was it. And that sameness changed too. Early on, it was how to be a good American, right? Mm-hmm. Like we taught, that was the sameness we taught. Everybody needs to be a good American. Mm-hmm. And then post, in the latter half of the 19th century, we start to shift towards more socialized kind of things. But you're picking up on that. The notion of toxic masculinity is the idea that masculine elements inherently are toxic. Now, we know anything taken to an extreme can be toxic. If you're abusive, that's a toxic trait. But Jordan Peterson has a powerful quote that really still resonates with me. And he said, you have to be capable of great harm in order to be virtuous, because the restraint of your ability to harm and violence is where the virtue is found.
That's right.
If you are incapable of harm, you're harmless.
Yeah.
You're not virtuous. You're harmless. So in essence, you have to possess the trait and show the restraint on it.
Yeah.
In order for there to be virtue as a man, well, those people who can't show the restraint are not virtuous. They're toxic, right?
That's what is the ability to do great harm, but not doing it. Is that what?
Right.
That's the virtue.
The virtue's found in the restraint. If you're not capable of it, you're not virtuous. You're not doing anything special. You just can't do it.
That's right. Yeah.
You're harmless.
Yeah.
And you could apply that to a lot of different things. So I think that's where inherently we went wrong with the toxic masculinity piece. Where did it go wrong, resident historian?
I'm wrong, right, good, bad. Sarah and I, somewhere along the way in our 25 years of marriage, started using the word healthy and unhealthy. Because, I now have learned that there is this promise in life of paradox. And by very definition, things will crash into our life that are true on the opposite ends of the spectrum that blow our mind and whisper to our spirit. And if we are thinkers, we're going to have a really hard time with that. And so sometimes I get to the notion, and like, this is what I'm going to bring this up to. So all three of us here, gosh, we believe in something beyond ourselves. We can raise our kids to the best of our ability. We can partner with our wives. We can watch our kids grow up and maybe one day raise their own kids. But there is still this mysterious, messy, magnificent, miraculous endeavor that we still give our time, our attention, and our soul to. And that's something beyond us, of understanding the scriptures, embracing the gospel, embracing that good news, embracing those red letters, looking at a story like the Good Samaritan, which is just straight fiction. It's a parable, but it's embedded with so much truth. Who's my neighbor? Like the dude who asked Jesus about who's my neighbor expected a particular answer, and he got this whole other thing. And it was Jesus who gave the question back to him at the end of that parable. And that expert of the law had to end up saying, the one who shows mercy. Mercy. So when we say right and wrong, when we say good and bad, I mean, we can debate, and I grew up in a house where we debated a bunch, and we were mean a bunch, and we declared victory after getting louder and shutting someone up. And then all that did was create tension to the next time that a decent conversation came up. We were still going to try to battle to victory rather than to some illumination, to some greater awareness, some greater understanding, to land on the same page and go, yeah, that ain't easy, but that's good. Like, that's one of our family mottos, is like, let's do good, hard things together. And for raising our boys specifically, it's been take care of yourself and be willing to take care of other people. But you can't take care of other people until you learn how to take care of yourself. And so I believe in that, that rugged individualism. But even when you twisted that term and went with rugged masculinity, that brought me to the John Eldridges of our life, that somewhere along in our own journey. Yeah, absolutely. Where you're beginning to understand that, man, life is just going to be an absolute mess. Go ahead and embrace that adventure.
Yeah. There's a great book, and I buy it in bulk and give it to any young man that's becoming of age. Mm-hmm. And no, it's not mine. It's not the one I wrote.
Naked Truth?
Naked Truth is not it. Although I do recommend it. But it's written by Erwin McManus, and it's called Barbarian Way. Huh. And it notes what happened after the death of William Wallace. Everybody probably at this point has watched Braveheart. He dies at the end. Sorry for the spoiler for those of you who are like 30 years behind in your movie watching.
Yeah, you had time.
Yeah, you had time. But Robert the Bruce, who was kind of known as this diplomat that was wishy-washy on the relations between England and Scotland, becomes the banner carrier of essentially Scottish independence, right? And eventually dies in battle. Robert the Bruce does. And they chalice his heart in this chalice. And there's this great story that Erwin tells about the Scottish barbarians who were not, battling. They weren't like the Roman phalanx, which they're marching together. They were really like tigers as opposed to lions. He's making these comparisons. Uh-huh. But he talked about that kind of rugged individualism and masculinity that exists in that space. And he tells a great story where they throw the chalice with Robert the Bruce heart in it into the middle of the battlefield, and they yell to the barbarians, go fight for the heart of your king. Right? Like, this is this really powerful moment. But it's a great book that kind of resonates with what you just said. We have to figure out how to embrace the better, healthier parts. Mm-hmm. What's healthy? Rob Alderman, who is my former co-host of Man Up America,
sure,
dear friend of mine, he and I talk about manhood a lot. We talk about the example of Christ, the restraint, the very restraint. I mean, this is the guy who Satan says you could take yourself off the cross. Right?
Yeah.
You could command. You could have, when he's tempting him in the desert, you can do these things. He's clearly capable of far more than he does. for the man who sold the story of mercy that we see in the Good Samaritan and other parables, arguably exemplified it to its nth degree, right? To its maximum degree. So much restraint, so much ability and yet restraint. So Rob and I, one of the common phrases that we use is Daddy's standing at the mouth of the cave. And that comes from a conversation he and I had years ago where he said, I wonder what true manhood is. And I said, well, let's talk about it. Let's see if we can discover what we would think that would be.
Yeah.
What would characterize true manhood? And we landed both on one notion, which is if you are truly a man embracing masculinity, you should always make your environment safe. People should feel safe around you.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where we leave the toxic thing, right?
Sure.
The toxicity of abuse, of violence, of aggression, all those kind of things that make the ability to instill fear in other people, even though it's very Machiavellian, is not necessarily the epitome of manhood. It's not necessarily who's the strongest, but it's the ability through possessing that strength to make anyone in your space feel safe because you're there. So everyone sleeps tonight because Dad's standing watch at the mouth of the cave. Everyone sleeps well tonight because Dad's at the mouth of the cave, right?
Yeah.
That old kind of primal sense about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try to be that way as a father, right? Like my children are never going to shudder at the raising of my hand.
Yeah.
Right? Even though discipline has come in my home, what my children have experienced is this example of when Daddy's here, things are better. It's going to be okay because Dad's here, right?
Yeah.
That's the thing you want to gravitate to and you want to capture in masculinity. And my concern is in this culture now that has introduced the toxicity of it, that we lose that. You mentioned earlier, it seems like everybody's got to, the thing that you're noting is we don't have any watchers anymore. We don't have any warriors. We don't have any barbarians. Like
we don't. And the note that I'm making is when, us three in this room can easily agree on what toxic actually is.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm pointing to is when a society is telling us that things that are masculine are now the toxicity themselves.
Yeah, it's one-dimensional. That's what I say to people.
Yeah.
You're being too one-dimensional.
That's right.
You're pointing to the abuse. You're pointing to the extreme.
Mm-hmm.
And most of those people who've led those narratives have had very abusive relationships, right? These are very personal traumas that emerge in greater sociological debates. But ultimately, I guess what I'm trying to be right now is kind of this omen to say, be careful, because if you don't have the warriors and barbarians, no one feels safe anymore.
That's right, yeah.
And that's a problem. It's a problem for people who aren't masculine. That's a problem for femininity. That's a problem for innocence in children. It's a problem for everybody if we don't have a society full of people who are willing to possess the ability of great harm and violence and with restraint, use that restraint to create safety in the environments in which they're in. Mm-hmm. We have to have men who can go to war and protect our country. We have to have people who can make you feel safe in a dark neighborhood. We have to have people who can make you feel safe by being a supplier for the family. And so I just caution people to say, don't be so one-dimensional when it comes to masculinity. There are inherently good traits about it. Just because some might possess them and others don't mean they're inherently more valuable or what to any space. Mm-hmm. But they are important, I think, when it comes to raising children, stability of a family, and henceforth stability of society.
Yeah.
And it's interesting when you think about safety, that is actually a nurturing quality.
Can be.
I mean, think about it. Providing safety is nurturing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I wouldn't disagree. I would even argue if absence of nurturing, like even if you could provide a wonderful perimeter, if there's nobody inside keeping the hearth warm and keeping the food there, and there's an inherent safety that comes through nurture too.
So now we're talking about parenting, and we're talking about the value of having two parents. And we talk about, hey, in every other situation, whether we're talking about coaching or we're talking about teaching or we're talking about the workplace or we're talking about the work ethic of a generation, when, we can do our big umbrella talks and then we get very personal with the people that are in our space and begin to hear their stories. And be respectful of their journey, but also meet them where they're at and say, all right, well, what is next, and how do we share these steps together? Because we're in this classroom together, we're in this workplace together, we're on this team together, we're at this church together. How does that all fit together? I just think that, like, man, it comes back to parenting. You start asking the question, well, have I met their parents? Because as soon as you meet their parents, you're meeting so much of who they are. And so it's like, I can teach all day. I can coach all day. I can preach all day. I can volunteer all day. But have they been parented? And right. That's a monster. Well, so how do we meet parents where they're at? How do we help parents? Because I'm a teacher, but I've been given the opportunity to adjunct over at Lee a little bit and be a teacher of teachers. And in my heart, man, that's at my very core. I think that's really what I want to do more than anything else, maybe on this back half of life, because I want to be in that space of understanding. But at the same time, if I just said the priority is, man, parenting, then I have to release some of that control of what I have of being able to shape a next generation of teachers or a next generation of students or a next generation of players. I got to get it close to being or the strongest or the healthiest or the whatever of taking care of my own kids. But, and this is where him and I, and I got to invite some other parents into my life. I've got to, when you mentioned perimeter, that made me think of that's just not me creating a perimeter of safety for my family, but creating a community. Because, once our kids get to a particular age, and, we already talked earlier today about, we want our kids to be independent, but we also want our kids to they're going to start their own family one day. So I need other voices in their life besides mine, especially during the time when they're crossing the threshold into independence. I want some truth. I want some hard truth. I want some of the simpler things to follow. I want love. I want joy. I want self-control. I want resilience. I want motivation. I want instruction. I want empowerment. I want to come from my home, but also in these other places that they land from the coaches and their teachers and their Sunday school teachers and our neighbors. And, how well are we, is a question that we ask ourselves. How well are we building community around our kids as well?
Well, that's the grand humility of a good parent. What you've communicated is knowing what you have to supplement with, what you don't have. I do rites of passages with my kids. And when my kids get around 15 or 16, we identify roughly a dozen other people in their life that they spend a day with to ask questions, to see not only what they do professionally, but how they navigate things. They instill lessons in my children. It involves my brother-in-laws, my father-in-law, my father, friends of the family we call uncles, and it's because at that point I'm pivoting in that adolescent year of them understanding that they have to be something more than a carbon copy of me.
Yeah.
That's not my goal, is to recreate me in society. That's not my goal. They have to kind of bring those things into that space so they can see. And it goes back to that whole, it takes a village notion, and there's some truth to that. But ultimately, we talk about parenting, and in us who have traditional parenting situations, we're all married to the mother of our children, right?
Yeah.
We've raised them in traditional homes. Mm-hmm. We're what we call the nuclear family. Many people are parented outside of a traditional parenting arrangement.
Sure.
And it's great that we as a society have people who step up into those parenting roles, but the interaction and the relationship between the child and that individual is still a parenting-oriented relationship. They're still doing that job, executing those tasks. And that's very, very important. Some teachers do that. You guys see teachers fill that role all the time. See aunts and uncles do it. Grandparents, man, grandparent guardianship is at an all-time high in our society. But, I'm clearly, anybody who Googles me is going to find out, I am a conservative politically. Uh-huh. But a lot of what drives my politics is my opinion of the family. I'm very, very family. In fact, when I ran for office, my campaign shirt said across the front, family, right? And it's not just a pivot off the basketball shirts where it's always about family and stuff. And they use family in the sense of connectedness in terms, but it really is the central focus because I have a cornerstone. There are two fundamental philosophies I base my opinion of government and politics off of. One is that the nuclear family is the cornerstone of any healthy society. And you have a lot of people who do not agree with that notion. They almost thumb their nose at the nuclear family, despise it for what it represents. Maybe it's because they couldn't have it or whatever, but still the most healthy basic relationship of governance is that.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that we legislate morality. There's not a law in our books that isn't based on a moral premise. And both of those are rejected in a political conversations all the time. But family's that important, right? I'm not saying it's got to be a traditional nuclear family, but you need to have a nuclear support network with the breadth from nurturing to play and safety and security and all of those things. And the people who have those things really do grow to be very powerful, well-rounded, stable individuals.
Uh-huh.
And I'm not saying other people don't, but I'm saying we do know that formula works pretty well. Very, very well. And so at some point we got to get back to encouraging it a little bit.
Yeah. Hey, let's use that as a transition because I don't want to let you leave here before we talk about some other things. And we could carry on this conversation day and night and day and night.
I haven't eaten up the time. Like no. I haven't dodged the hard stuff yet.
We're close. You're almost there. You're almost there. By the time anybody hears this conversation, you'll be back in session in Nashville, and you'll be on the front lines. And in your words, you'll be carrying our banner, and you'll be representing us. Talk to me. You just touched on it a little bit. You almost answered my question with your last statement, but talk to me about because let's take into consideration a guy like me. A guy like me is living his life, man. I've got my nose to the grindstone. What's right in front of me is getting attacked metaphorically. I may not always be super informed on the most behind the scenes things that are happening in my state legislature. What do you carry with you? We've already heard some of it. What do we carry with you? What do you carry with you to represent me? What's sort of your guiding light? You've already mentioned that you're a conservative, that family's a big deal to you. Talk on that for just a minute, Adam.
Well, I don't have to try too hard to represent the district because my family and I are really representative of it.
You really do, yeah.
The joke in Nashville, I had a reporter, a liberal publication, attack me in the hall one time, and he said, in 2 years, or 3 years at the time, he goes, in 3 years, Senator Lowe, we're going to get you beat down there in your district. And I said, you'll get another one just like me. And he probably has the same haircut. I'm not that exceptional in my space. I don't consider myself exceptional. My wife and I, we're both working parents. Our children are in public education. My wife works in public education. I've been a small business owner in the community. We both have professional careers. We go to church. There's a sense that we really do represent the average family in this district.
Uh-huh.
And so it becomes pretty easy. Like I can act normally, as I'm compelled to act because I feel like I am living that nose to the grindstone existence. Mm-hmm. We're a citizen legislature. This is not a full-time job. I have to have a career on top of it. So I work the same kind of patterns that you guys have to work on a regular basis. But the biggest thing that I think that I do is always make sure that my experience in the political space doesn't start to distort my perspective because I'm privy to information and knowledge serving up there that my average constituent back home is not.
That's right.
Right. And I try to make as much of that available for who want to know it. Like you represent people first and foremost by do they trust you? Mm-hmm. I tell people all the time, I do the things up in Nashville and do all of that so you don't have to worry about it if you don't want to.
Yeah.
But if you do want to worry about it and you do want to know it, I try to make it as available to you to know it as you can. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's the notion of transparency and all of that. But I'm constantly having to check myself by making sure, especially when we're home, like I have been out of session, that I'm doing the things that I've always done, which is dinners with locally elected officials, with people that I'm friends with, podcasts with guys who we've connected over youth sports over the years. You have to make yourself live life normally to make sure you're kind of keeping your thumb on the pulse of that space and what people need and what their concerns are. Also, it's not just Nashville that can distort your perspective. When you move into a position like I am, the amoebus institutions that transcend the family begin to appear in your life, things that most people don't encounter, right?
Yeah.
Because they start to lobby me. Like most people aren't having conversations about public utility, right? But I have to have conversations about, most people aren't having conversations about broader notions of public education, conversations about local contracting and regulation with regards to building codes. All of those things are things most people, unless you're in those industries, don't interact on a regular basis and have to live in those spaces. The emergency in that space or the opportunity in those spaces, I have to always measure it back to what real people are encountering and kind of dealing with on a regular basis. So that's kind of as I'm ramping up to go to Nashville next week, or like I said, I'm probably up there if you're listening to this podcast.
Yeah.
I'm making sure that I take everything from being back at home with me up there. I want Nashville to know how we feel and think in Southeast Tennessee, what our values are, what's important to us.
Yeah.
That is the most important exchange. I'll spend a little time trying to make y'all understand Nashville, but it's more important for me that Nashville understands y'all.
That's a great statement right there. Did you have something, Paul?
No, that was good.
From what I understand, youth mental health is a big deal right now, and it's something that you're spending quite a lot of time thinking about and pondering on. And is it a school counselor bill that you're going to be carrying in the next few weeks?
We'll have one. That's going to be probably a multi-year endeavor.
Okay.
So the way the legislative process works, a lot of times you can get a concept into space, gather consensus on it, even pass it in committee and get it behind the budget so you can start working on finding the funding to do it, right? So sometimes you can pass an idea, but it doesn't really become reality until you get the money to do it. We are understaffed in Tennessee with regards to school counselors in our counseling space. And when I say understaffed, I mean, it is physically impossible at a ratio of 350 students to one counselor.
Yeah.
For that counselor to recognize depression, anxiety, distress, suicidal tendencies, all of that formula, all of that recipe that leads to things like school violence, premature suicide, failure and dropouts at the school mode. Our counselors can't do the job. So we've got to have more warm bodies on the ground. Now I can pass a bill funding those positions and getting them funded and in place. We still need people to go into those careers. That's the broader issue we're having, not just in school counseling, but in the mental health arena, is we just don't have people who want to do that job anymore. And it's a high-paced, stressful job. It's litigious in certain ways. But here's where our problem is. The generation of children before us right now, ages 10 to 20, are 3 times more likely to be anxious, depressed, and suicidal than any generation before. And we know exactly what's causing it. That's the big thing. We know that it is the detachment in a device-driven culture that creates artificial realities on social media and in cyberspace that compel people away from real human interaction.
On top of creating unreal expectations and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, real life waits on you.
Yeah.
But you're absent from it. And so the consequences of real life are there. Right? Like if you're driving a car and you decide to drift off into social media land, checking your likes and shares, and you're not paying attention to the road, you go off the road and hit a bridge. The consequence of real life is there. Like you're at least going to be hurt, if not dead.
Yeah.
So the consequence of real life doesn't go away, even though this generation of youth have descended into these alternate realities that create human detachment. We use this term asynchronous learning. Like even our interactions are different than they were generations before. We post and then we wait long cycles of time for the feedback. Whereas in synchronous interaction, like you and I are having today, that happens in real time. I can read your body language. I can say something. If I've said something wrong, you can correct me in real time.
Mm-hmm.
I can pivot back on it. I don't have to wait till 100 people have already judged it and how wrong it is before I pivot back on it. All of those things are consequential and leading to mental distress in youth. So what can we do about it? We have to look inward to public education because it's the only place institutionally we interact with that demographic. And so we got to figure out what we're doing to empower those counselors that are in that school setting, and having more of them recognizing those things are going to help us. It's going to help us in the youth violence. You know, everybody wants to compartmentalize it and say, we need to look at school shootings. Well, you can't look at school shootings without looking at school shooters. You can't look at school shooters without looking at what compels people to be a school shooter, and not just incidentally, but the mental capacity and distress that they're under when they make those decisions. We have to look at those things.
So what do you do? I said on our first episode that, you know, in the future, there has to be sort of this rethinking. And it sounds like those thoughts have begun already, of the school counselor position and how that is, the numbers at which they're staffed. How do you protect? So let's say things move forward and you get funding and you start attacking those numbers or the lack of counselors in schools to help meet this problem. How do you protect those positions from being overwhelmed with their schedule being filled with scheduling electives for students and what's the big ugly word? Testing. Yeah. Testing. That takes up a lot of their time. Now, I'm sure if you didn't do anything, numbers are going to help for sure. But is that something that's in that conversation of how do we put counselors in that can be counselors during their day? Well, in school, counseling is not therapy. Number one, like this is first line or front line interception of recognizing there's a problem, getting people the correct resources to deal with the problem. We're setting a standard of threshold for FaceTime. A lot of it just goes back to FaceTime with students. And you're right, administratively, depending on who's in charge, a lot of those people have been drifted away to other duties that don't have that FaceTime with students. They're not interacting with students. And so we have to kind of get back. There is a standard in the state of Tennessee from the Department of Education that says 80%. Like 80% of your day should be student interaction based. Okay. It should be in the hallways, the cafeterias, looking kids in the eyes, recognizing when something's wrong, so, you know, when things have changed, those kind of patterns. Yeah, I got you.
It's not close to 80%.
No, I know.
So setting a standard and having some sort of accountability. I mean, there is a huge gap between those two things.
Correct. Right now, it's just guidance that's kind of been in there. Yeah. I think as a state, we'll kind of put some teeth to it to say, and when we say teeth, this is what needs to happen. Yeah. For the most part, there's a lot of goodwill in public education in Tennessee. Most systems integrate what comes down, especially if funding's tied to it. But what I'll say, we go back, you know, we spent most of this podcast today talking about family, parenting, and all that kind of stuff. The biggest thing we can do for our mental health epidemic is parents have to police device culture. My children, my oldest boy who's 20 now does, but my 17-year-old daughter does not have social media. Yeah. You know, my other kids will not have social media. I encourage parents, do not let your children on social media, even though they can create their own profiles at 13. We're trying to, as Tennessee, compel big tech to change that. We'll pass a law in Tennessee requiring it to be 16. They'll fight us. Yeah. And they'll fight us for not very pure reasons. They'll fight us because they know if they can get access to rewiring your child's brain at 13, they'll control their political and consumer behavior for the rest of their life. Sure. They want access in that developmental stage. Well, there are consequences to that. So we're trying to run interference on those things. But the best thing you can do is be the interference of your children. Read a book by Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation. It is the most collective gathering. It's kind of a clearinghouse of all the data we know empirically from what has happened since 2010 in a device-driven culture in our children. And if you read that book, I promise you, you will look at the device in your child's hand very, very differently going forward.
Yeah, I bet so. Man, something I do, a habit I started doing when I first started teaching. Now, as you all know, listening, and as you know, I came from a law enforcement background in this community. So when I started teaching and I got my first roster in our computer system, I realized I can just click on a kid's name and I can tell you where they live. I can tell you who's allowed to pick them up from school. If there's someone who's not allowed to pick them up, I can see that information as well. So one of the first bits of information that became valuable to me was where they live. Because as a sheriff's deputy, I knew every street in the county, and I'm not making any judgments based on where this kid lives, but I can have a little insight. And as I'd whatever kid's name starts with A, I'd click on their name and it would tell me a street name. And I would just go to that street in my mind and try to imagine what kind of world might this kid be growing up in. Now, again, there's not a lot of weight put into how I react to that. I don't use that information for anything. I don't ever even mention it to anybody. But at moments when I start getting maybe some real out of normal behavior from a child, I can sort of level with them as if I'm a deputy on their street, and I start seeing sort of some context of what they're growing up in or because believe it or not, this is a pretty dynamic community. All the way down to, I could walk you down. Meet me on the east side over here at midnight, and I'll walk you up to a place and I'll show you about 10 people that's been huddled around the same campfire every night, ever since I can remember in our town. Okay. That's where they live. They're not homeless. They own the property. They just don't have a house, all the way to, the Anatoles of the world or the gated communities. And we get a little bit of all of that.
Where Salisville lives.
At our school. Where's Salisville live?
High cotton. We call them high cotton areas.
Yeah, he's
community.
That is not true. Do you know what Matt's doing when he does that? Mental health counseling.
What's that?
When he makes that observation, leans into his previous experiences and he brings it into that moment. I mean, that's how we're processing. I mean, as teachers, we are in the trenches.
Sure. Yeah.
I want more. I want Candy Del Bonis in my classroom, Leo Walker, Kim Blackaby. I want them. I want my kids to see their face and hear their voice before that tragedy, that trauma, that mistake, that regret, that before they end up in there, so that there is some rapport. So that is one thing that I have intentionally done throughout the years, learning that. So, Spangler used to take me out of my related arts classroom and put me in the counseling office for 1 block a day, just so I could be that fella to track down those boys and they can hear another voice, so I value what you're doing. I know Matt values what you're doing.
I do for sure.
I know that we're all in this together, and I want you to be encouraged that there are people in the classrooms, just like the two of us. I mean, you know us well enough that you're not surprised by us saying either one of these things, but there are other people that are in these classrooms doing their best to identify those things, to pass it on to that counselor who can pass it on to someone who really can intervene, and it can be significant. And we can capture some of these moments and turn some of these kids, just point them in a different direction, to consider something different.
Well, it matters to your ability to teach as a teacher if a student is prepared to learn.
100%.
And there are so many distractions standing in the way of a child's ability to learn in your classroom. I mean, we have some wonderfully compelling data to consider, and encouraging data, like the fact that kids who have considered school violence, and when I say violence, it's not always the shootings, it's literally maybe fighting and those kind of things.
Yeah.
Chose not to pursue that path because of one interaction. One interception in the sea of everything that compelled them to the moment to act. One intervention prevents them from doing it. We've known this from suicide data for a long time, right?
Yeah.
Like the one phone call kind of approach, like just one reason not to, for so many people, intercepts that process and reboots it.
Yeah.
But we also know that we're losing teachers at an astronomical pace in the state of Tennessee. 85% of them say they're leaving education because they cannot meet the needs of the students in the classroom. Think about that for a moment.
Yeah.
It's not the pay. It's not the bureaucracy. It's not the changing test scores.
No.
Those get a lot of hype. But the exit interviews of people who leave, literally walk away and say, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
It goes back to the condition of the student in the classroom, their ability to get to them, their ability to teach them or not teach them, the behavior the student exhibits or doesn't exhibit in the classroom. So at some point, we can talk about youth mental health and counseling, but all of that is the basis whereby we make sure when a student enters a classroom that they're in the optimal position to learn what you guys are in there to teach.
Yeah.
That's the goal, that they're the warmest to it. They feel safe. They feel capable. They feel intrigued. We want all of those kind of higher order thinking things, but we can't even get there if we don't have A, their attention away from a device culture, and B, some emotional mental stability to where they feel like that they can take on that knowledge.
Yeah. And that's where I was going with that is, that first semester in 2018, I would have 2 or 3 kids with an alert like, hey, dad can't pick her up or mom can't pick this person up. The other day, I checked one of my new rosters for this semester and all students except 4 had some sort of alert to that effect. Or they're in a grandparent, they're being raised by a grandparent, one of those kind of things. All the way down to, my first semester in 2018, I had a student that was homeless.
Oh, wow.
I don't mean homeless with her parents. I mean, her parents were essentially gone, and I was working with counseling because she wasn't staying where she was supposed to stay. They were working with juvenile court. I'm sorry, I've just got something in my throat.
That's all right. Well, I mean, all of those things matter. Those things, when they're taking place in that moment, and again, there are elements of real life that our kids face.
Yeah.
That are distractions from learning. They're incapable of learning when those things are hovering over them. Why we're seeing an increase in it is we've now created those same traumas and dramatizations in a cyber digital environment. They're worried about how people are liking or sharing something on Facebook, what somebody made in a comment is. That's why the schools are going to crack down on access to even that during the daytime.
Yeah. Okay, pause just for a second. So you and I have talked about AI. And embracing AI and teaching students how to figure out this ain't going nowhere. I mean, because the internet was a thing that it was here to stay, whether we wanted to or not. And I've told a story of like, man, I just want to do my bibliography, my works cited out of books. Why do I have to go to the internet? And that seems ridiculous now because the internet did not go anywhere and it's not going to go anywhere. And artificial intelligence is, man, Adam, it ain't going nowhere.
No, it's not.
And so we're saying one thing, but then this other thing. And so it's really both things. And so this is the world of education. This is the world of parenting. And this is the world that you're trying to navigate and just saying, hey, what kind of assistance through legislation can we bring to both of these things? I mean, see how hard this is. And then people look at education and go, I'm going to go into that. And I mean, our local universities are already reporting that, that not as many people are entering into these teacher programs or, getting certification through these teacher programs. So it's already hard. It seems like it's getting harder. But for some of us, we ain't going anywhere.
Why learn if AI can learn for you?
Well, that's how we figure out how to navigate that.
And we're dealing with that in higher ed too, where one of the big challenges we have with AI is it's horribly inaccurate right now. Because it draws from the ether.
Sure.
And people put so much wrong and incorrect information into the ether. It draws from it too. I had it write I had it write a paper on me one time. And it was so horribly inaccurate, Yeah. So
have you utilized it yet to truly collaborate though? I'm talking to you personally.
Yeah. And so this is what I was kind of pivoting to.
And if you have, tell us something you've used it for.
Well, as far as,
because we're fascinated.
I'm going to tell you where I'm interacting with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's not a Zoom call I don't log into that people aren't using an AI assistant. And I struggle with that a little bit because it tells me you're using technology to do a job for you. And my immediate question is why? Because it could be one of two directions. It could be, a pretty positive thing in the fact that you're using it for efficiency. You're using it because it allows you to do these other tasks, or it could just be laziness. Right?
Sure. Yeah.
But I don't know. There's got to be another layer of relationship for me to understand where it fits in your life.
Uh-huh.
I haven't been overly compelled to use AI at the moment. And part of the reason is AI is a very consumer-driven technology. And when you look at society as a whole, especially in the digital internet space, you have about 90% of people who consume it and 10% are creators like you guys right now. I mean, you're creating content, right?
Yeah.
As a content creator, there's still kind of two camps there. There are people who are using AI to integrate and enhance their content. And I'm not really in that space. Like my content creation, it tends to be still in a more academic space where we're still having to watch AI, the threat of AI.
Uh-huh.
And so my experience with AI, and I've got to temper myself, has been the most negative sides of AI.
Yeah.
Where it's coming in, it's introducing bad information. It's replacing true cognitive processing or people's ability to think. People are using it as, and I'm not talking like a crutch where we say, well, the calculator created a generation of people who can't do math. You hear that all the time.
Yeah.
And there's some truth to that. Like anybody who's been to a Zaxby's, not to pick on Zaxby's, but
you're picking on Zaxby's.
That's not the most recent situation I had where I paid in cash and it was like a 404 error in the eyes of the person behind the desk. You know what I mean? So you guys have been there.
Coffee. I told a story 2 weeks ago.
So yeah, this happens. Like there's a consequence to that. So what my message, I've been back to my children, that's where I start. But my message to anybody is, I agree with you. AI is not going anywhere. From a governmental perspective, we have to make it as most honest and controllable as it needs to be, because I saw Terminator as a kid. I know what Skynet looks like when I see it. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, but we have to make it to where it doesn't get out of hand. And we have to understand the consequences that come with it, just like the invention of the calculator.
Yeah.
People can't do quick math anymore because the calculator is readily available. And so we have to be aware of those things. What I will tell you is healthy concern with AI is important right now, because for all of the people in the AI space who are trying to create another tool to enhance humanity, you have just as many people who are creating it to exploit humanity. And that's the balance of government that we have to try to tackle. And I'll just tell you, from higher ed to what I experienced in Nashville, no one's got a good handle on it.
Yeah.
And that's
scary. I mean, and the same for the internet, but watch this. When magazines were created, when books were created, I mean, like there are books that enhance
where the storytellers go. It's written down now. You don't need grandma. Yeah.
But I mean, you follow what I'm saying. I mean, any technology, that printing press changed things forever, right? And so now things are put into print. And the first thing was the Bible. Yeah. But even that Bible split Europe in two.
Oh, right? Yeah. There's people that didn't like about it. Well,
because any technology that comes along.
You have people who want to broker and control knowledge and wisdom. And those people are always threatened by enhancements. But again, you have to look back and ask yourself, what is it replacing? Like there's still a consequence, right? When we automated the automotive industry, there was an occupational consequence, right?
Yeah.
We know that manufacturing has moved to where that used to be a second chance for the guy that dropped out of high school, could get into some manufacturing and make a decent living wage. There are less of those jobs now. Those jobs have gone to people who can manage the robotics on the line. And you can't do that if you dropped out of high school. That's a compelling narrative to your kids, right? Finish high school, right? Like those jobs don't exist as much anymore, but we still need them. And so there's always a consequence. And so you have to evaluate it. I agree. It's here to stay. It's not going anywhere, but we are not beyond making sure that it's the most honest and healthy tool that it can possibly be. We can continue, like in any other industry, to police the bad actors, create laws around people who choose to manipulate others. I'll tell you, one of the most dangerous arenas for AI right now, and you guys might have gotten it, the ability to mass text and communicate to people for the purpose of financial fraud. Like it used to take, you had to, all right, if I was going to engage in exploiting the elderly or calling people and convincing them they were about to be sued if they didn't send me $2,000, I had to hire people. There was startup cost to that. It has now gotten to where there's almost no startup cost because of AI. And so we see this very aggressive uptick in AI use for the purpose of fraud. We have to be able to navigate that, control it, squelch it if we can.
If we let him keep going, he would give so many avenues that we haven't even considered of what could happen with AI. And all we've camped out with is in our classroom.
I'll tell you.
Or content creation. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, for sure. For sure.
What you do is fascinating, man.
Part of the conversation that we've been having is, at least right now, we can start having conversations of how to, from our perspective, to try to use it responsibly and what the difference in content creation and plagiarism. It's as simple as that for a teenager who thinks, oh, this essay is going to be really easy, because they have Chat GPT.
One of the big dangers of academia is once it's introduced. So here's the thing. I work in higher education in academia, right? And specifically in doctoral and master programs. So I get thesis and doctoral dissertations in. When we approve that dissertation, it makes its way into the catalog of wisdom in the field.
Sure.
Which means we've essentially stamped it as accurate and approved. If we let one source in, it forevermore is part of citable research, even though it was fabricated by AI. This is the pressure on higher education academia right now with regards to how to use it. What are we doing with AI? Is because we can't afford to let anything through that gate, because it's supposed to be the purity of knowledge whereby we judge whether everything else is correct. If one source fabricated, didn't exist, was created through an AI tool, generated in the ether, or whatever the case may be, makes its way into a dissertation or a paper that is approved and cataloged in the higher educational arena, forevermore the rest of society cites it as truth.
Yeah, for sure.
Or could cite it as truth. Think about that for a moment.
Yeah.
And we have to be right 100% of the time to protect the integrity of that academic space, of what we consider empirical and academic truth. 100%. How many universities in the nation? How many doctoral programs? How many master's programs? How many theses being written annually? I know I have 1,800 students in my doctorate program at Liberty. Students currently.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's a threat.
It's a threat. It's a big deal. Yeah.
Well, listen, man. We're just trying to have fun.
Oh, yeah. We're just trying to have a good time, I've realized in the last hour and 20 minutes that we're going to have you back at some point. And we sure appreciate you coming. And
we'll travel to Nashville.
Yeah. I'm putting you on the spot before we get off here. When are Paul and I coming to Nashville?
Well, anytime you want to come, and if you want to do a podcast in Nashville, the good news is we have everything up there for you to do it.
Remote on location.
I love it. You just come and do your thing. But Paul's already been up and he's done the dime tour.
Yeah.
Looking for the quarter tour at some point.
Yeah.
And Nashville's an amazing place. Although I do miss home. I'm grieving right now, I load up in the morning and go up, and I'll be up there 3 days every week until May. But I grieve at this point because I like my time in the district better than Nashville.
I bet.
But there's so much history there. It's amazing. I walk through the same halls and sit in the same room and cast votes in the same space that Davy Crockett did. We still have a working Capitol.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah. We hold session in our existing Capitol. It's not been converted to a library or to a museum. We're meeting in it. So I hold the same handrails across the same granite and marble.
Yeah.
You know, it's really interesting. So it's an honor to serve and to be up there. And yeah, anybody wants to come up, I'll take you around and show you what I love most.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks so much for being with us today, man. And we wish you the best, and you'll be in our prayers and our thoughts while you're there. And we'll see you soon. We'll be contacting you. Paul and I will make a pilgrimage at some point soon,
Sure.
I hope. So,
Sounds good.
again, thank you. And until next time, listeners, thank you.
Man, that's downright mindful. You've been listening to Downright Mindful with your hosts, Matt Paris and Paul Salzville. Produced by Josh Morris. Intro and outro production by Derek Kinsey. You can find us wherever fine podcasts are downloaded. Thanks for listening.